Welcome to the Darkstream. I'm Voxday, voxday.blogspot.com. It'll be interesting to see how many people show up for this one tonight. I don't think free trade is on the short list of a lot of people who've been watching these, but we'll see. One never knows. I don't know how long this one is going to take. It might go on a little bit longer. But it's going to take as long as it takes. I've decided that we're going to do. It's going to require at least 4 parts. We're going to address sort of the 3 primary. It's going to address the 3 primary arguments that are made by certain advocates of free trade. We're going to start out tonight, and we're going to address David Ricardo and the comparative advantage argument that is the basis for most free trade arguments. Now, let me give you a little background on why my opinion might matter, why I have some idea what I'm talking about, and also to point out that this is not a debate. Try to keep your questions. If you've got questions, what I would encourage you to do is write them down, and then we'll do a dark stream at the end where we can address everybody's questions. And so let me give you a little background. First of all, I'm an economics major. I'm also the author of 2 economic bestsellers in economic theory. One is The Return of the Great Depression. I wrote this back in 2009. No, I'm sorry, there's no way for me to turn up my mic. This is just, it's a limitation of the iPad mini. Anyhow, The Return of the Great Depression, I wrote this in 2008. It was during the, around the time of the financial crisis. A lot of people don't realize it, but I predicted the financial crisis of 2008 back in 2002. And it wasn't just one of those things where you say something and then you get lucky. It was something that was very clearly going to happen. I even repeated my warnings in March of 2008. And so, and then of course the crisis hit that autumn. So anyhow, The Return of the Great Depression is one of my books. My other economics book is On the Existence of Free Trade. And so that's a debate of mine with Dr. James Miller, who is a Chicago School monetarist. So that's my publishing background with regards to that. Now, just so you understand, for those of you who are natural free traders, I want you to understand that I'm very familiar with the conventional free trade arguments. So, for example, here's some of the books from my library. The Capitalism and Freedom, of course. A lot of people who have read Milton Friedman are familiar with that. Then, of course, there's the famous Free to Choose. I think I read this. I think my dad gave it to me to read when I was 10 or 12. I was raised on Milton Friedman. So that's why making the switch on free trade was very difficult to me. However, I didn't just read the obvious stuff, the easy stuff. Here's a monetary history of the United States. Very in-depth work that he wrote with Anna Jacobson Schwartz. Most people who are trying to talk about free trade and waving around their Friedman and stuff have never even heard of this book, much less read it. And I even read, although in some cases it felt more like trying to read, Friedman's The Optimum Quantity of Money and Other Essays. Very difficult book to get your head around, a lot of higher level math and that sort of thing. But my point in showing you this is not to say, hey, look, I read books. My point is to point out that I am familiar with the conventional free trade arguments. You're not going to tell me anything new. A lot of people think that when free trade comes up, they say, Ricardo, as if that is a meaningful response. It's not. Summoning the I'm blocking this guy. He's really getting annoying. Yeah, you guys, look. If I'm talking about a given subject and you keep trying to change the subject, I'm going to block you. I'm not interested. Okay, it's not difficult to understand. We're talking about free trade tonight. Um, but so the point is that a lot of people uh, don't understand that, they don't understand much about economics, and they basically have what I would call a Cliff's Notes grasp on it. So they know that the answer to free trade has something to do with Ricardo. Maybe they even know what comparative advantage, the name of the theory is. Maybe they can even tell you what it is. But that doesn't mean that they understand it, and they have no idea what what it's about, what its deeper meaning is. And so David Ricardo's arguments, you can find them here in, this is a good summary of them, a collection of his essays. It's called The Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. And what a lot of people don't realize is that David Ricardo was a very smart guy. He was a really clever guy, but he was a politician. He was not really what you would call a professional economist. Now, they didn't have professional economists back then, but the point is that when he was writing these things, he was not writing them in pursuit of truth. He was writing them as essentially political essays. And so he was trying to make a point. And what a lot of people also don't realize is that he had some very, very silly ideas. The reason that he tried to advocate for his position on the corn laws and taxation and that sort of thing is because it was deeply meaningful to him. So you had the iron law of wages, which someone just mentioned there. He also had this rather bizarre theory of profit, which stated that all profit was based on the price of corn. Now that may sound insane, but I mean, he's got what sounds like a halfway convincing argument for it. Schumpeter, Joseph Schumpeter, in his great History of Economic Analysis, actually makes fun of Ricardo, and he talks about Ricardo's method of argumentation being getting rid of all possible variables, so that you've only got two things left, and then he's able to make his argument that way. He called it the Ricardian vice. John Maynard Keynes was actually given to those sorts of arguments, and it's something you occasionally see in the media today. So the point is that David Ricardo is not some sort of magic spell that magically waves away any objections to free trade. Now, what the book that was very important to me in understanding this, and I would, we don't publish this, I don't get anything out of it, but I would highly recommend that if you find this Periscope interesting or useful, look up "Free Trade Doesn't Work" by Ian Fletcher. The 8-point argument against comparative advantage and David Ricardo that I'm going to explain is straight out of this book. I've basically just added an 8th point and simplified some of the terms. And so, excuse me. So let's talk about first of all, we'll talk about what comparative advantage is. What comparative advantage is the idea that even if you're not the best at doing something, that it still might make sense for you to focus on one area of production while your trading partner focuses on something else, and that even though they're more efficient at both, in the case that Ricardo used, he talked about cloth and wine production. Even though England was better at both cloth and wine production than Portugal, he demonstrated using some numbers that he just randomly assigned to it. He demonstrated that both countries would be better off if England focused on producing cloth and Portugal focused on producing wine, and then they traded. And the argument is very, very simple to understand. Fletcher describes it as the football player mowing lawns. Okay, now the football player is an athletic guy. He's in shape. He can probably mow the lawn more effectively, more efficiently than someone else. But does it make sense for the football player to mow his own lawn? Why would he want to mow his own lawn when he can, in the amount of time it takes him to mow the lawn, he can go out and get indoor, do an advertisement where they'll pay him $30,000. So comparative advantage says that the football player should hire somebody else to mow his lawn and then go and make more money doing something else. That he's, even though he's better at both, his time is better used elsewhere. Comparative advantage is basically that concept blown out to nations. Now, here's the problem, and here are the 8 false assumptions. They're not all entirely false. In fact, Fletcher calls them dubious assumptions. But since the majority of them are just completely false, I think it's more accurate to describe them as just false rather than dubious. So the first false assumption is that the comparative advantage is sustainable. Now, that's not necessarily true. In fact, not only is it not necessarily true, it's almost never true. Japan had a cost advantage producing cars against the United States in the 70s. They used to be able to produce them much more cheaply. However, because of their success in producing cars and building them, their costs went up, and now Japan is no longer a low-cost manufacturer. They no longer have the comparative advantage that they had. The same with BMWs. A lot of people don't realize that BMWs used to be inexpensive imports. Now they're high-end, top-of-the-line cars because the production methods change, and so what might have been a comparative advantage now may not be a comparative advantage, and probably will not be a comparative advantage in 10 or 20 years. So that's the first false assumption, because according to Ricardian theory, the comparative advantage should remain where it is. It should remain static, but it's a dynamic situation, so that's a false assumption. Number 2, the advantage depends upon there being no new costs imposed by the trade. Fletcher uses an economics term, externalities, but all that means is that there's no new additional costs being imposed. Now, obviously, we know that because of trade, there are considerable new costs being imposed, because what do the people who are not working on wine production in England do? Well, we know they go on the dole. So there are a number of new costs being imposed, and in any welfare state, comparative advantage cannot possibly apply. So we know you cannot defend free trade on a comparative advantage basis because of the costs being imposed by unemployment. This is also tied to the third false assumption, the idea that production factors move easily between industries. Okay, if you've got a wine press, if you've got, let's say, a vineyard, the comparative advantage theory says that you need to be able to transfer that, change that into a cloth production factory without any cost, or at least with a very small amount of cost. Is that true? No, of course not. That's why it's a false assumption. So the point 3, the third false assumption is that production factors move easily between industries. They don't. And then the fourth false assumption is that trade will not change the income distribution. How is the country going to be better? Remember, the argument is that free trade is going to make the country better off. Okay? But that's only true if the fact of the trade does not change the way that income is distributed in that country. So, for example, what we're seeing right now is it's partly because of free trade, but more because of the financial infrastructure. What we're seeing is that because of over the last 7 years, or what is it? No, really, I guess 9 years since 2008, the financial elite are doing extremely well. They're doing better than they've ever done before. Is everyone else doing better? No, not at all. And so, because the act of trade changes the nature of income distribution. And so, even though some people in the country will be better off, most people may not be, and in fact, what we've seen, most people are not better off. And so, that's the fourth false assumption. Trade does not change the income distribution. So, now the fifth point is interesting. The fifth false assumption is interesting because Ricardo even admitted that this was one of his assumptions, and so his theory was auto-refuting if this factor came into play. And obviously it has, because the fifth false assumption is that capital is not internationally mobile. Well, it is. We can transfer money now by clicking on a mouse. Capital is not just internationally mobile. Capital is absolutely dynamic. It flows around the globe at the drop of a hat. And so, back when Ricardo was writing, he was thinking of capital in terms of actual physical gold and actual physical investments. And so, since those factors no longer apply, we know just on that basis alone that comparative advantage cannot be a rational defense of free trade. The sixth false assumption is that short-term efficiency is the cause of long-term growth, long-term economic growth. So, the idea is that Portland, it's more efficient for Portugal to produce the wine. It's more efficient for England to produce the cloth. Now, does that efficiency automatically translate into economic growth? No. It might be things might be better, might be a little more efficient. You might have a little bit more cloth buying or wine drinking because of that efficiency at first, but that says nothing about the way that economic growth is going to take place over the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, whatever. So again, the argument is that this free trade is going to make the country wealthier. Well, it's only going to make the country wealthier if that short-term efficiency leads to long-term growth. Now, this is more of a dubious assumption than a false one, but regardless, it's definitely a strong argument against it. Yeah, good idea. I'll block that user too. Let's go to point 7. The seventh false assumption is that trade does not cause adverse productivity growth abroad. Now, this is a slightly more complicated issue, so I'm not going to... look, stop talking about the volume. I can't do anything about the volume. I've said that every time, every single time. I can't do anything about it. So, stop requesting that I do something about it. I can't. Seventh false assumption. Trade does not cause adverse productivity growth abroad. What that means is that the act of trading causes the production to rise in the country where the goods are being produced, right? Well, because they're producing more, that's going to affect their productivity. Their productivity is going to grow. Portugal, because they are now producing wine not only for themselves but also for Britain, they're going to start changing their production methods, and as their productivity grows, then that is going to have an effect on their comparative advantage to England. And so, like I said, it's a little bit complicated. I don't think it's necessary to go deeply into it, but I just wanted to mention the point that it is a legitimate argument against comparative advantage and the Ricardian theory supporting free trade. Finally, and this is the point that I have added, and it's a very strong argument that we'll get into more depth in part 4, but the eighth false assumption of Ricardo's comparative advantage theory is that labor is not internationally mobile. Think about it. If it is cheaper to produce the wine in Portugal, then what if the reason for the cheaper wine in Portugal is because the Portuguese workers are cheaper, right? So now Ricardo is assuming that the Portuguese could not come to England. Because if the Portuguese could come to England, then England could produce the wine less expensively in England. The drives the rates down, drives the wage rates down, and so that completely explodes the advantage of free trade right there. Why bother trading if you can import the labor and produce it more cheaply yourself? Now, there's also the idea of if it's cheaper, if it's cheaper in Portugal, and you can move the capital, why not go and set up in Portugal? That's another option. And again, that, I mean, I guess technically you could still say that that's technically trade because it would be a British company producing in Portugal. But the point is that it fundamentally explodes the whole idea of two nations both becoming more wealthy by engaging in free trade. And so, the reality of free trade is that the less wealthy country tends to get wealthier. The wealthier country tends to get poorer overall, but there are well-connected elites in the wealthier country who benefit from it. And so that's why they endorse it, and that's why they keep pushing for it, even though it is literally destroying the economy. Now, it is very, very, very easy to demonstrate that free trade has been terrible for America and has been terrible for the U.S. economy and has in fact made it poorer. Now, some people say, well, how is that possible? Because because the GDP has grown and blah 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 and all this sort of thing. Well, it's really, really simple. Wealth is not GDP. GDP does not represent wealth. GDP represents income. Okay, it's the difference between what you get paid and what you have. And what people tend to leave out, now it's obviously it's very difficult. It's very, very difficult to calculate what do we have. What is the total U.S. wealth? Some people have tried to calculate it, but we don't need to do that to prove that free trade makes the USA less wealthy. And the reason is that we have to subtract debt. Okay, if you have $1,000 and you have and then you have $5,000, does that mean you're wealthier? Yes, unless in getting that $5,000 you incurred $10,000 worth of debt. Your net wealth, you went from 1,000 to negative 5,000. You are poorer than you were before. And so if you look at the U.S. GDP, which has grown, over the U.S. debt, you can see very clearly that the GDP over debt has decreased. That means that the USA overall is less wealthy than it is before. Now, can we blame all of that on free trade? No, of course not. You can say that we don't have truly free trade. You can say that there's other reasons for the debt, et cetera, et cetera. But the point is that we can look at what has happened, and because what we're doing here is we're not making our own argument against free trade. We are defanging, we are rebutting the pro-free trade arguments being made. They say, look at GDP. The GDP has grown. It's because of our free trade and so forth. And what we can say is, no, that cannot possibly apply because the USA is less wealthy than it was before. Okay, so that's not a anti-free trade argument. That is a rebuttal of a pro-free trade argument. So anyhow, I hope this is helpful. Like I said, this is just part one. We will go tomorrow. I'll give you a little homework if you want to prepare for tomorrow. Or actually, I don't think we'll do it tomorrow. I think what we'll do is we'll skip a day. Do a regular Darkstream tomorrow, and then the following day do part two. But so that gives you 2 days to read this. What I'd like you to look up is a book called Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. It's from the Mises Institute. You can download it for free. Yeah, we're not going to do this on Saturday. I have a debate. We'll do it on Sunday. No, Sunday's the Super Bowl. Okay, I'll figure it out. We'll do it soon. But the point is, read chapter 11. It's very short. It's like maybe 3 pages. Chapter 11 of Economics in One Lesson. It's a chapter that's it's all about free trade. And what'll be interesting is note down if you see anything that looks wrong to you, note it down. I'm going to give you the specific errors that are made in this free trade argument, and then you'll be able to see exactly, you'll be able to see how well you do in spotting them. But I'll give you a hint. There are definitely actual flaws in there. So, we got a couple. We managed to get through this faster than I expected. So, if you have any questions, do you have any questions related to the Ricardian aspect, comparative advantage aspect of free trade? If you do, go ahead and, okay. Has Miller adjusted his curriculum and teaching in response to his discussions with you? I have no idea. I should talk to him, actually. I need to I need to see him get some royalties paid for his for our book. So he very kindly allowed me to publish that. We co-authored it. Can Trump stave off another depression? No, that's beyond the power of any president, I think. Why talk about trade? Because my background is economics. I'm interested in economics, and it's a hot issue right now because that's an important area that Trump is focusing on. I mean, he already killed the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He's hopefully going to take apart NAFTA and so forth. Maybe even get us out of the IMF. Who knows? Despite my objection to the commenter, don't you think it's important to talk about George Soros? Not particularly. Everybody knows about Soros. What do I have to add to it? Hungary is doing the right thing, and Russia's doing the right thing by kicking his organization out, and the U.S. should do the same thing. The man is fomenting revolutions around the world. I don't understand why world leaders tolerate it. What is the alt-right position on free trade? I think most alt-right guys are a little bit, they tend to lean to the free trade side. What are the odds of a U.S. dollar currency collapse? It's not going to be hyperinflation. You can look it up. In fact, we should be publishing it sometime soon. You can look up the inflation-deflation debate between me and Nate at Vox Populi. And I'm a deflationist, so I don't think there's any chance of hyperinflation. What about the cheaper goods argument? That's a non-argument. We can address that at some point in time, but it's not a serious argument. You see people bring it up, but so what? You can buy some things cheaper, other things become more expensive, and it's irrelevant. Any other questions about? So equities will correct? Yeah, absolutely. The reason that the stock market is so high is that is the inflation we have. Those prices are inflated, but that inflation will not go out into the greater economy. What is the ideal trade policy? I don't know exactly. I'm not. I haven't. I'm not an expert at this point in time. I'm just learning. Maybe passing. How many of these trade talks? There's going to be 3 more parts. 3 more parts to this. Yes, I still think that there will be the U.S. will collapse as a political entity by 2033. That I estimated that 15 years ago. I see no reason to. Would deportation affect wages significantly? Absolutely. It will raise them. Well, thanks very much. I hope you enjoy. I realize this was a little bit more academic than our usual dark streams here, but I hope you enjoyed it. And I'll look forward to seeing you all soon, probably sometime tomorrow.